Good afternoon or morning or wherever you are. This is Dr. Carolyn McMakin with our frequency-specific microcurrent introductory seminar for people that have questions and want answers. I want to go through some basic material about FSM so that you'll have some information before we start asking questions. That will save everybody some time. So this is more or less the short version. Frequency-specific microcurrent is basically a new paradigm in medicine that, short version is, it changes outcomes and ends up changing lives. So the history, everybody wants to know where it came from. And so the history is that frequency-specific therapies were developed in the early 1900s, mostly by MDs and osteopaths in the US, the UK, Germany, all more or less at the same time. And they were used by thousands of physicians until about 1934. Now in 1910, the Flexner report came out and said that medicine had to be standardized. There were no medical schools, there were no consistent medical practices. You could go to an MD, 4 MDs in one city, and get 4 different approaches to what you had and 4 different treatments. So they wanted to standardize medicine and created medical schools. Well, what happened after the Flexner report is that medicine decided that drugs and surgery were the only tools allowed in medicine. Everything else was labeled as ineffective fakes, and that included frequency-specific therapies. So nutrition, herbs, homeopathy, and frequency therapies ultimately by 1917 or 1920 were outlawed. And then they got serious about it. And every medical intervention, except for prescription medication, was outlawed. Any physician who used these tools would lose their license to practice. The devices went into the back rooms. The history and the research were all lost. If you've ever packed up your grandfather's house after he passed away, you know that nobody knows what to do with his library, especially if he's in a specialty like medicine or engineering or something. Some of the practitioners actually went to jail. They were persecuted in general. Harry Van Gelder was an osteopath and naturopath in trained in England about 1943, 44. He came to North America, to Canada actually, in 1946, and he bought a practice that came with a machine that was built in 1922, and that machine came with a list of frequencies. So this is what I received from one of Harry's students, George Douglas, and I received the list in 1995, and this is what it looked like. There was a number, and there was a name. So 9 was to, we thought, reverse, obviously not cause allergy reaction. 50 was to reduce congestion. 284 was to reduce bruising. The machines looked kind of like this. They were different. And George Douglas worked with Van Gelder in '83 and bought home a copy of that list written on pieces of binder paper stuck in a drawer. Well, we resurrected the list. That is, he gave me pieces of the list in 1995 when the machine that we had looked like this. It was a 2-channel precision microcurrent built by Glenn Smith in California. And Harry's old machine had 2 channels. So we started using Harry's list and ultimately found out that the condition did better when it was on channel A and the tissue did better when it was on channel B. We are uncertain with how the frequencies were derived, uncertain of the mechanism of action. Got some ideas, as you'll see, but all that research was lost. It's just gone. When your grandfather's library disappeared, when the journals went into the rare book room at the naturopathic colleges or in the Quack Museum in Chicago, it's just gone. So we have no way to know. We do know that the 1920s therapy was not microcurrent, and the 1920s equipment was not microcurrent. It plugged into the wall back when wall current was direct current. So we first started using the frequencies in 1995 to treat muscle and nerve pain. And then our results in 96 were so outrageous that I had to teach them to find out if they were reproducible. So was it really working, or did it just appear to be working because I was a nice guy and the walls of my clinic were pink? The thing is that, so we taught them in 1997. And the thing is that it's teachable and reproducible. The benefits have been consistent, continually improving as I learn more what I'm doing with it and how to teach it better. The effects are teachable and reproducible. So everything you're going to see in this presentation and everything that we teach in the what we call the core seminar is reproducible. If we can do it, you can do it. Research in animals and humans has progressed in 25 years, and the clinical results have accumulated over the next 20 years. So how's this stuff work? Well, what we don't ever think of is that drugs and nutrients change cell function like keys in a lock. If you want to reduce inflammation, right, you have these receptors on the outside of the cell that respond to things like pathogens. If you have a little hangnail and it gets all red and inflamed, that's a pathogen-associated molecular pattern. If you have a cut and the tissue is damaged, or you have a damage-associated molecular pattern, it affects this receptor. That receptor changes what are called kinases inside the cell. That changes the transcription factors that tell the genes what to do. And that makes the genes in this cell create inflammation. So if you take ibuprofen or naproxen or Toradol or any anti-inflammatory, it acts on this receptor like a key in a lock and changes all this activity inside the cell and turns the inflammation down. Okay, that's how it works. Now, frequencies seem to change cell function with a signal like your key fob. If you opened your car door with a key remote this morning, you have used frequency-specific technology. The frequencies from this list appeared to change the membrane receptor configuration and therefore this cell function, but it does it electromagnetically with a signal instead of a key. So, for example, your key remote sends a signal exactly and only to one car, just your car. Your key fob, this little gadget where it says unlock the door, opens only your car, even if there are 12 identical cars all in a row. Your key remote opens only your car with a single frequency tuned exactly and only to your car, the front door, and if you're lucky, a little beep and the lights flash. FSM works like that with specific problems in specific cells. So how do we know this? Well, we knew it clinically, and then we just got lucky. In 2003, at the University of Sydney in Australia, Vivian Reeve and Wayne Riley conducted a animal research trial where they paint arachidonic acid on the mouse's ears, and then they measure these little hairless mice with the caliper. So it's fairly low tech and inexpensive. So they found that one frequency combination, 40 hertz on channel A to reduce inflammation, 116 on channel B to address the immune system, that frequency reduced inflammation in the cell actually by 70%. And Vivian Reeve has been doing this research for 18, 20 years. And at the end of 10 animals, she shut down the lab. And she said, something's wrong. In 25 years, 20 years of doing this research, I've never seen a prescription or non-prescription drug that reduced inflammation by more than 45%. So you guys are cheating. So go home and come back tomorrow. So when they came back the next day, she had everybody in separate rooms. The person that was painting the mice was in one room with the door closed. The person that was measuring the mice was in a different room with the door closed and the window with a piece of paper over it. And the person that was treating the mice, that's Wayne Riley. And this is what we used to use. We used to use graphite gloves. And Wayne Riley would grab the little mouse by the back of the neck and by the tail and run current through the mouse. Now you notice he hasn't got his hands on the mouse's ears, but the ears are what were painted with arachidonic acid, and the ears are what are measured by this nice lady with her calipers. So with everybody being really, really careful, lipoxygenase mediated inflammation, which is one kind of inflammation, was reduced by 62%. There was a 30% reduction in COX inflammation, which doesn't sound as good, except that's equivalent to injectable Toradol, which is the drug they give you after surgery when you've had your hip or knee replaced or have had any kind of surgery that causes inflammation. And that's the first time we found out that there is a 4-minute time-dependent response. That means that the full effect is there in 4 minutes. Half the effect exactly is there in 2 minutes. So that was the first time we had an indication that this was how it worked. Also, Vivian put in a placebo frequency. So she just left the frequency blank, and Wayne didn't know it. And the placebo response was about the same as you would expect. Not much, nothing. So other frequencies that we tried, current alone, just 1/10 of a hertz on both channels, no reduction. 90 minutes of our frequencies to reduce minerals in bone, no reduction. And 4 minutes of frequency 91, which is reduced minerals in bone, had no reduction. And then 4 minutes of our frequencies for trauma produced no reduction. Now see that frequency allergy reaction? That's what's over here. That's this. It reduced inflammation a little bit, and Wayne said that you could feel it, but it wasn't like the frequency to reduce inflammation. So some of you, all of you, may have heard of a condition called fibromyalgia. Well, the medical community considers fibromyalgia to be untreatable, incurable. This is what you have. Take drugs, learn to live with it, have a nice life. Well, in our world, fibromyalgia can be cured. We just could not get the paper published if we said that as part of the title. So the title is cytokine reduction associated with fibromyalgia associated with spine trauma. What we found was that only one frequency reduced the pain. This is what the pain pattern looks like. Their average pain was about a 7.4 in a group of 54 patients. It was reduced from a 7.4 to a 1.3 in 90 minutes. Only one frequency reduced the inflammation. All the cytokines were reduced in 90 minutes. The recovery program, how you got over it, varied depending on how long you'd had it, what your general health was, what your life was like. The best patient recovered in 2 sessions. The average patient took 4 months. And they also got FSM in the office. Some of them had FSM home units, physical therapy, reconditioning. They were better in 4 months, but it took them about a year to get reconditioned and back to having a life and, playing tennis and jogging and doing the things they were used to. We had to do rehab on their gut and their adrenals. The thing that takes the longest is medication management and withdrawal. So if the more meds they were on, the longer it took to get them better, because we not only had to get their pain down, we had to deal with the effects of the medications. And then it was only 40 hertz on channel A and 10 hertz on channel B that reduced the pain, and it reduced all of the inflammatory cytokines. So I gave a lecture at the National Institutes of Health in 2000, and I said to the group, we have done this 25 times at this point. They all come in at an average of a 7, they all leave at an average of a 1. And nobody's going to believe it unless I have some data. So Terry Phillips came along and said, you get me a spot of blood, I will tell you what changed. So interleukin 1 in this, as an average, was reduced from 330 down to 80. The p-value on that, which is a measure of statistical significance, is 0.004. TNF-alpha went down from 305 to an average of 78. In the index patient, it was even lower, but these were all averages and included this one patient that didn't respond. All the rest of these were much more dramatic as an average. Substance P went down from 180 to basically 5. That p-value has 3 zeros. Endorphins go up. The one side effect with this treatment is you get more or less so stoned you can't talk. Went up from an average of 8 to an average of 71. P-value there is 0.003. Pain was reduced from an average of 7.4 to a 1.4. P-value here, the published p-value is 3 zeros and a 1. Statistically, when you do the math, it's actually 6 zeros, but the statistician is British, and he said you'd only publish 3 because anything more than 3 is showing off. So we published 3. It was only 40 hertz on channel A to reduce inflammation. And my hypothesis was that the spinal cord was inflamed in these fibromyalgia patients. So 10 hertz on channel B was the frequency to address the spinal cord. Now in the published paper, if you go to our website and read it, it says through trial and error. There was no trial and error. 40 and 10 was the only frequency ever used because 10 hertz was on the list for the spinal cord. What I found out after we got this data was that in medicine, inflammatory cytokines are hard to change. And when they change slowly over months. It takes 3 months to reduce TNF-alpha if you take the drug and you've got rheumatoid arthritis. 40 hertz reduced all inflammatory cytokines by 10 to 20 times in 90 minutes. That's never happened. It's not possible. And we've done it hundreds of times at this point. We have data on 50, well, we have data on 13 patients. And then when they returned, if you notice here, they return at a much lower level. They do come back, but they're lower. So at this point, you ought to be asking, how can a frequency do that? How does it do that? Well, think about it. Interleukin 6, TNF-alpha, interferon gamma, CGRP, and substance P are all produced by specific cells in response to specific signaling. And after years, like literally 18 years of exploring with different physiologists and neurochemists and neurophysiologists and biochemists, there's no other thing besides changing cell signaling that could change all of these so quickly. It's the only reasonable explanation. So these cell receptors on the outside respond to external factors like bleeding, bacteria, tissue fragments. They activate these kinases that change transcription factors, that change genetic expression to create inflammation. And the data shows that these cell receptors also respond to frequency signals that turn that inflammation off by changing the receptor and changing the internal cellular response. It's the only thing that makes sense. So Microcurrent devices were approved in the 70s as TENS devices, even though they have about 1,000 times less current than a TENS device, so they're not actually TENS devices. They're prescription, as a TENS device is or used to be. They're approved for aesthetic use, like in skin care stuff. That's non-prescription, but in general, the studies are all done on wound healing and pain control if you look in the medical literature under microcurrent research. Microcurrent devices vary widely. There are different waveforms, 1-channel, 2-channel, combined units in ultrasound with interferential, galvanic, and microcurrent all combined. Generally, the frequency has never been important until 97 when I started teaching this. There were a limited number. There was a gadget called, a device called an AccuScope that did a sweep of frequencies from 0 to 1,000. FSM units require 2 independent channels with 3-digit specificity. So you have to be able to run 284 hertz to reduce chronic inflammation and dissolve blood clots. And you have to be able to run 396 hertz if what you want to do is address the nerves. So the screen has to show what frequency is running. Some of the cheaper made in China kind of microcurrent devices don't have a screen because it doesn't matter. They're either on or they're off. They're either running current or they're not. The frequency doesn't matter. What they found out about microcurrent was that as long as the current is below 500 microamps, it increased ATP production by 500% or 5 times, depending on how you do the math. ATP is what your cells use for energy. Now, with that increased ATP energy, the cells increased, and this is in rat skin in 1982, increased protein synthesis by 70%, amino acid transport by 40%, cyclic AMP in human lymphocytes in vivo, that was done by Seegers in 2001. And she says it activates signal transduction, which means that it just means it's easier for the cells to talk to each other. And this was done in vitro, which is like in cell cultures, and in vivo, which is in living systems. This was published in Medical Hypothesis. So frequency-specific microcurrent is not about the device. Everybody wants to know what your device will do. My device delivers frequencies and current. Frequency-specific microcurrent is not about the device. It's about the frequency effect. Everybody wants it to be about the device because selling devices is how you make money. Teaching people how to use frequencies is a little more complicated and considerably less profitable, but that's another conversation. So what does FSM do, right? Why should you know about it? Well, it improves healing. If you know anybody that has diabetic ulcers, you're familiar with what this looks like. There's +2, +3 pitting edema. His feet were numb in 7 out of 10. Those little X's are places where he couldn't feel anything. The end of this toe is beginning to be necrotic. That's the 3rd toe. The space in between his toes doesn't look great either. End of this toe was being set to be amputated, but they were kind of waiting to see if they were going to do both of these toes at the same time. And it was healed in 6 weeks in 6 to 11 treatments by a practitioner named Nori Collier in Texas. And the setup is really easy. We put a wet towel around the patient's knees, a wet towel around their feet, so the current goes from one place to the other. We treat the blood vessels. First year I treated this, didn't work. Couldn't do a thing. Why is that? I was treating the nerves. Then I actually looked it up. What is the cause of diabetic numbness, diabetic pain, diabetic wounds? It's all about the blood vessels getting gunked up with the things that gunk cells up in diabetes. So it improved healing. So this is 8 days. So she's treating him twice a week. This is almost healed. It was healed in 1 more week. And this one was completely healed in, I think they treated him 6 weeks. Sensation was completely restored in 4 weeks. If you've ever seen or treated a diabetic neuropathy patient, that's not possible. And we do it all the time. FSM and anti-aging. This is pre-treatment. Now she's pretty to begin with, right? But look at the orbital lines around her mouth. A little bit of jowliness here. The labial folds, that's the other thing it's really good at flattening out. And this was three times a week for 2 weeks, twice a week for 2 weeks, and once a month for maintenance. In animal studies, there was a 39% increase in blood supply after 20 days of treatment in rabbits. This is at University of Washington. 14% increase in collagen, but 48% increase in elastin, which makes this skin able to move when you talk and make facial expressions without making wrinkles in 20 days of treatment. So there is one frequency combination, 40 hertz on A for reducing inflammation, 35 hertz on B, that reduced liver inflammation basically in 4 hours. This gentleman, well, this was done in Australia, so he went on an alcohol binge over the weekend, came in with fatigue, nausea, digestive problems to see one of our practitioners who's a nurse and a naturopath in Auckland, New Zealand, Joe Sutich. So his initial blood levels were AST as a liver enzyme. It was up. 45 is the upper limit of normal. It was 75. ALT was 222. Normal is 40. 383. Normal is 60. Alk Phos normal is 120. His was 140. Now, the reason these enzymes show up out in the bloodstream where you can measure them is that the liver cells are dying. They break open, and the enzymes like AST and ALT that are inside the cell fall out into the blood where it can be measured. Now, the normal sequence of events when you have these kind of elevated liver enzymes is they continue to go up for 7 to 10 to 14 days, and then they gradually decline. So 2 days later, so they didn't do anything. They said, obviously, stop drinking. They gave him some supplements to take. When he came back in at 9 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday, so this is Monday, he came back on Wednesday morning as expected. This is not unexpected. It's also not as bad as it could be. 75, AST went to 582, ALT went to 547, GGT, which is the most sensitive, went to 709. And they treated him for 60 minutes. Primarily, 20 minutes of that was with reduced inflammation in the liver. They used another 2 or 3 frequencies on the liver, but this is the money shot for liver inflammation. And then God bless Joe Sutich, just sent him to the hospital to get a blood draw 4 hours later. So this blood draw was at 9 o'clock in the morning. They treated him from 10 to 11, sent him back to the hospital. This blood draw was at noon. His AST went from 582 down to 36 in 4 hours. That's not possible. 547, ALT went to 133, GGT went from 709 to 493. Now, these are still well above normal, but AST seems to respond the best. And you could think this was a lab error, except this has been replicated in 2 other clinics. They just haven't ever sent me their data. They just told me about it in emails. So that's one. There are frequencies, obviously, to reduce inflammation. It reduces pain, redness, swelling, doesn't change range of motion, doesn't do anything else. Frequency for fibrosis and scarring dissolves the scarring, increases range of motion, doesn't do anything for pain. Hemorrhage stops bleeding and pain in the menses and prevents bruising. Kidney stone pain, so far since 2002, when we stumbled upon that combination, it has been effective in every case, but it's not useful for anything else. Now, what happens when you can stop bleeding? So you have this frequency to stop hemorrhage or bleeding, right? What happens when you can stop bleeding? This nice lady had facelift. She had mid-face, chin. I think she had a forehead lift. You can see the little Band-Aid up there. So they go in and did a forehead lift. So good surgical technique. They put in drains to drain out the bleeding, so that was good. There's her with a little bear on her chest. Day 2, our practitioner treated her immediately post-op for 80 minutes and then treated her daily for 7 days for 80 minutes. Day 2, day 4 is a little bit of bruising. Day 5, she's a little bit puffy, so as the bruising consolidates and the lymphatics are here, she gets a little bit puffy. Day 6, not much bruising, no makeup. There's a Band-Aid. There's incisions under her eyes. Day 9, I'm not exactly sure what happened, but her face is a little bit puffy on day 9. It might be the way her hair is combed. But this is day 11. Now, obviously, she has makeup on, but if you've ever seen anybody 11 days after a facelift, they don't look like this. This is what happens when you can stop the bleeding. That's what the frequencies do. So you should be asking, how can specific frequencies change conditions in specific tissues? So the observed effects, there are immediate changes in tissue, there are immediate changes in sensation. The pain goes down, it gets warm sometimes, and it stops when the frequency is finished, and then there are lasting effects. So as you might have noticed, I'm a little bit science-driven, I'm data-driven, and I love that it works, but it's not magic. It's not woo-woo. It's not voodoo. It's physics. How does science explain the observed effects of FSM? Well, you got to come with me here for just a minute. And the fact of the matter is, lots of books you can read to teach you this, but come with me here. The human body is a quantum biological system. So Newtonian physics works for large objects like your whole body. If you drop it off a building, it's going to accelerate at 32 feet per second per second. Quantum physics, Newtonian physics falls apart at the molecular level. So quantum physics describes the behavior of molecules, atoms, and subatomic particles. And the fact of the matter is that living tissue, your body, that stuff that you're looking at, if you look down at your arm, that living tissue is really made up of biochemicals. And those biochemicals are made up of molecules, atoms, and subatomic particles. So they are held together. All those atoms, molecules, and subatomic particles are held together by electromagnetic bonds. They have to stick together with something. That's what these little sticks are, right? And the fact of the matter is, in physics and chemistry, mechanical engineering, civil engineering, every bond has a frequency at which it resonates. So now there's another adjustment you have to make to the way you think about your body. We think about cells as these water-filled sacks. And if you cut them open, the water would run out. Well, no water. The water in your cells lines a gel. There's a gel matrix inside your cells. It looks kind of like this. And the water lines up on these with the oxygen, probably oxygen molecules stuck to these lines in here. And the hydrogen atoms vibrate. And when the hydrogen atoms vibrate, they form structures that act as a semiconductor. This isn't me. This is a biophysicist named Albert St. Georgi, Georgi. And he published this in 1986, but he'd been working on it since the 40s. So your body is actually an electromagnetic system that looks solid, but these hydrogen atoms inside the cell act like a semiconductor. So silicon and germanium have just a hole in this silicon matrix that shows up in exactly the same place, so the electrons travel in a controlled fashion. water molecules flickering do exactly the same thing. Hydrogen atoms have a little hole, and when they flicker, that hole shows up in exactly the same place. So this semiconductor that is your body acts like a computer chip, and it conveys current, charge, and like your computer, it conveys information. So that's how the frequencies get through your body. It follows the water in the cells. But what's resonance? Right? The name of my book is The Resonance Effect. Resonance is the tendency of a system or a bond to oscillate at large amplitudes in response to some frequencies, but not others. So at the resonant frequencies, very small forces can produce very large amplitude vibrations. So when soldiers march across the bridge, starting in about the 17 or 1800s, they found out if you get 200 or 300 soldiers marching across a wooden or an asphalt bridge in step, and they hit the resonant frequency that holds that bridge together, the bridge will come apart. It happened. So to this day, when soldiers are marching in any army, any place, and they come to a bridge, they break step, because it happened enough times in the 17 and 1800s that they found out not to do that. Now, resonance also explains the immediate effects on the tissues. So you know that trick when the singer, like Julie Andrews, breaks a lead crystal glass by hitting a certain note with her voice? Well, it turns out there is a precise frequency that holds lead atoms together, but it has to be in a 70% or more lead crystal matrix that forms a crystal glass. The lead atom bonds begin to vibrate with the singer's note. If it's precise and sustained, then the lead crystal just comes apart, because the lead atoms are vibrating so much that they don't connect well to each other, and the whole glass just disappears. So FSM changes tissue really quickly, dissolves scar tissue, as you'll see, but it needs manual therapy, exercise therapy, nutrition, and lifestyle changes to create permanent effects. So what's that mean? Well, it takes back to physics again, I'm afraid. Energy wells in stable states is a concept from thermodynamics. And we're all familiar with the fact that water is completely stable as ice as long as the surrounding temperature is 0 degrees centigrade or lower, right? Then you add energy to that system and it's completely stable as a liquid as long as the temperature is between 0 and 100. You get to 100 degrees centigrade and it turns into steam. So the correct frequencies will create instantaneous changes and change the state of the tissue. Those changes are going to be permanent when the patient's metabolism, attitude, and mechanics support the change in state. Now, this next slide is kind of scary, but it just talks about all the things that are involved in a stable state. Ligamentous instability, poor posture, overpronation, muscle imbalance, deconditioning in general, segmental deconditioning in the spine, general health, nutritional. In our world, it's usually insufficiencies, usually of antioxidants and essential fatty acids, and especially vitamin D, and methylfolate and methyl B12, emotional stress, changes physiology tremendously, toxicity from heavy metals, allergies, gluten especially, and infections, chronic infections from viruses, bacteria, mold, Lyme, parasites. We talk a lot about these in the seminars. So FSM treatment is pretty well established. 1997, that's what, 23 years now? It's low risk. We have, it's reproducible and teachable. We have about 4,000 practitioners in 23 countries. It's reliable. It always does what it says it's going to do. It's non-invasive. It's comfortable, usually. It's billable because the devices are approved as TENS devices. And the equipment is reliable, and as medical equipment goes, it's pretty inexpensive. So what do we do with this? Well, if you dissolve scar tissue, that's me about 10 years ago, well, 17 years ago. This was in a burn unit at Mercy St. John's in Springfield, Missouri. Every patient we treated, I treated 8 patients, 7 patients stayed with it. One patient, we doubled the range of motion in his hip, and it scared him because it was work comp injury and he was worried about his settlement. But the 7 patient that stays with us, every patient has statistically significant permanent increases in range of motion after 3 one-hour treatments. Now, we have treated other burn patients, and depending on the kind of burns, the skin doesn't look normal, but it is more mobile. Dissolving the scar tissue makes the range of motion in the limb more flexible, more improved. There's one frequency combination. The only thing it's good for is shingles. This is successful treatment of shingles in the ophthalmic branch of 5 in an 85-year-old man. 4 hours of treatment. It was only one frequency pair back in 2000. I didn't publish it till 2010. He was pain-free in 1 hour, no return of pain. The lesions were gone in 48 hours. Virus has mutated since then, and now there's 3 pairs required. But they published the case report in part because the patient was David Simons, and this was the Journal of Practical Pain Management, and they knew him, but also because the expected outcome in shingles is 85-year-old men do not get over shingles in the ophthalmic branch of 5. We published papers in myofascial pain in 1988, which is how I met Dr. Simons. 5 years average chronicity, 88% had failed with 3 to 6 other practitioner types. I was never the first person they saw. Patients were their own controls. If they're going to have a placebo effect, it was assumed they would have had it with one of the 3 to 6 other treatments that have been tried. It took 11 visits in 8 weeks because I didn't know what I was doing. This was published in 1998. We just got lucky with the lumbar. Now, when I say I didn't know what I was doing, it's because I thought I was treating the muscle. What we've learned since 1998 is you treat what's causing the muscle to be tight and to have trigger points. Lumbar pain, 8 years average chronicity, 86% had failed with other treatments. 6 visits in 6 weeks is pretty average to get their pain down from an average of close to a 7 down to a 1.5. If you've ever pain at a 7, when you get to a 1.5, it's a very good thing. That was published in 2004. Neuropathic pain is the hardest thing to treat medically. It's the easiest thing we treat. And all patients experience pain reduction. 20 years, the average, 20 patients, the average chronicity was almost 7 years. Pain was reduced in the first treatment from a 6.8 to a 1.8. That p-value has 2 zeros. Second treatment, it came back up, but it never went as high as it was the first time. It came up to a 5, went down to a less than a 1. 65% fully recovered in about 5 treatments. No adverse reactions. However, 25% terminated care prior to recovery. And I think that has something to do with back then, 2010, I wasn't as good at it as I am now. And the fact of the matter is, if your pain has been a 7 for 7 years and somebody gets you out of pain in 60 minutes, it creates an identity crisis that is pretty much unparalleled in medicine. New injuries, the only thing we have published is in delayed onset muscle soreness. I forgot to put in the statistics, but these are the frequencies that we used, and there is no successful treatment for delayed onset muscle soreness, nor is there any way to prevent it. And every patient improved. The placebo group obviously did not improve, so that instead of their pain being a 7, it was a 2. I will have to change this and add this slide before Kevin sends them out. This is a patient with a stroke. She was 38. She had 2 treatments in 6 days. This was the first treatment. It lasted about an hour, took about an hour, hour and a half. This was current going from her neck to her feet. And after about an hour, half hour, the spasticity was gone in her hand. She could extend her wrist for the first time in 3 years. This is Kathleen Kasman. She is one of our physical therapists that's been doing this. And if you move the arm slowly, this is how we got her at the end of an hour and a half, I think, on the first treatment. And this is after we took the towels off. Now, a week later, 6 days later, she came in with this range of motion. So all of the gains we made that day were maintained. And at the end of the second treatment, we got all of the spasticity in the shoulder relaxed. This was done in Taiwan. So in general, the clinical use of specific frequencies is low risk. They either work or they don't work. If they don't work, they just don't have effect. There's nothing with them to resonate for. You'll see side effects, but they're transient. And in the seminars, you're given all the precautions and contraindications. Fortunately for us, medicine's pragmatic. Efficacy first, mechanisms later. Didn't stop us from using aspirin, willow bark for hundreds or thousands of years. And then when they purified it and treated it and used it as aspirin, they used that for hundreds of years. They didn't understand prostaglandin chemistry until they developed Advil in 1971. So think about what would happen to healing and everything you do for yourself or for your patients if you could reduce lipoxygenase-mediated inflammation by 62%, COX-mediated by 30%, all inflammatory cytokines, and increase ATP production by 500%, all in about 30 minutes. It takes time, it takes skill, but it's teachable, and you can do this, and you can benefit with it. FSM is a tool that makes medicine faster, more efficient, more effective, less expensive, and improves patient outcomes. I teach it in a 5-day seminar in the US, the UK, Germany. We're going to do that in the US in August, at the end of August, and then we're going to translate it into German and Taiwanese. We'll show those in 3 different time zones. You can look that up on our website. We also have 2 3-day US modules. This 5-day core seminar is, well, brutal is not an unreasonable word. It's like trying to learn a whole new language in 5 days. It's sometimes easier for people in 2 3-day chunks. You could do it in person, and as soon as this pandemic goes away, we will do in person, but we do it on video as a live stream. The core seminar has 6 hours of hands-on practicum, and when you take it on video, you get 4 hours of one-on-one instruction with one of our trained practicum instructors. All of the courses, you'll get individual attention, and you're, believe it or not, at 3 to 5 days, you are competent. You're uncertain of yourself, but you are competent and you are safe at the end of either 3-day module or the 5-day. 3-month up to forever learning curve. There's advanced courses, webinars, workshops. There's ongoing information all the time. The equipment's really inexpensive. Our equipment is US made, FDA, 510K approved. They have CE marks. The other equipment that's available in the US is mostly made in China, and we won't even go there. How to use FSM, there's a pain management textbook that I wrote in 2010, a little bit out of date, but it gives you the basics. That's published by Elsevier, the largest textbook manufacturer in the country. And then to learn about FSM, this is the fun one. Jim Oshman wrote the foreword, and he described it as a can't put it down page turner of a book. It's fascinating, funny, inspired, exciting, and altogether delightful, and everybody seems to like it. So it's called The Resonance Effect. It's available on Amazon, and I suggest you read it just for fun, if nothing else. It's a good way to learn about how FSM was developed and what it does. And this is the truth about what we do. Frequency-specific microcurrent, I got to warn you ahead of time. It will change your life, your health, your practice, and your outcomes more or less forever. And what we do is changing medicine, but we're doing it just one patient at a time. We're changing lives with every practitioner we train, and one patient's life changing one patient's life changes the world. And I really hate it when Kevin is right, because he told me this would take me 50 minutes to do. And I said, no, I get this done in 30 minutes. So we're going to stick around and do all of your questions and answers, since this was supposed to do a Q&A.